Kansas Territory, 1874. The prairie wind moved through the grass like something alive, bending the tall stems in long silver waves that rolled toward the horizon and disappeared. It was the kind of country that made a man feel either free or terrified, and usually both at once. Settlers were arriving by the wagon load that spring, hammering stakes into ground that had never heard a hammer, measuring off claims with rope and ambition, and making exactly the kind of noise that people make when they believe the future has finally arrived and they are personally invited to attend. Among them was a Scotsman named Alasdair MacRae. He had come from Fife, from the grey stone coast where the wind off the North Sea had a particular personality. Cold, persistent, and deeply uninterested in your opinions about it. Alasdair was 41 years old, built like a man who had spent his working life underground, which in fact he had. He had spent 22 years in the coal mines near Kirkcaldy, eventually rising to the position of pit foreman, a role that required him to understand not just the seams of coal above and below him, but the water tables that pressed against those seams from every side. He had seen men die because someone miscalculated where the water was and how deep it ran. He had no intention of making the same mistake in Kansas. His wife Clara had 3 opinions about this move to America. She thought the journey had been too long. She thought the land was too flat, and she thought her husband was entirely too quiet about things that other men would have the good sense to discuss out loud. She was from Dundee. She had her own opinions about silence. They settled in Osborne County in the spring of 1874 on a claim of 160 acres that sat on ground so level you could roll a marble from one end to the other and watch it gather speed the whole way. The nearest creek, called Drummond Creek by a surveyor with apparent literary ambitions, ran about 3/4 of a mile to the east, and every other settler within 10 miles had made a point of claiming land as close to it as possible. The closer to the creek, the more obviously you belonged to the category of people who understood things. Alasdair had looked at the creek and then looked at his land and said nothing, which Clara correctly identified as a sign that he was planning something. By the second week of May, when the temperature was still reasonable and the grass was the rich dark green of a landscape that hadn't yet figured out what season it was supposed to be, the first wells began to appear across the settlement. Well digging was a communal event by necessity. You needed at least 3 men, a windlass, a bucket, and a shared understanding that the man at the bottom of a 20-foot hole was placing a certain amount of trust in the men at the top. The standard wells of Osborne County that spring went down between 18 and 28 feet, hitting water in the shallow table aquifer that sat beneath the prairie like a broad, thin sheet of underground rain. It wasn't deep water. It wasn't what you'd call distinguished water. But it was wet. And on the prairie in 1874, wet was everything. Alasdair watched his neighbors dig. He watched Rolf Tanner, the loudest man in the settlement by some margin, sink a well on his claim in 3 days flat with the help of 4 German brothers-in-law who came from somewhere in Bavaria and had apparently been digging holes their entire lives as a kind of cultural practice. Rolf's well hit water at 22 feet, and he was so pleased with himself that he personally informed every adult within a 2-mile radius of the exact depth, the exact temperature of the water when it first appeared, and his personal theory that 22 feet was the ideal depth for an Osborne County well. No more and no less, as if the water table had been specifically arranged to accommodate his schedule. Rolf was 43, broad-shouldered, louder when he was wrong than when he was right, and deeply suspicious of anyone who did things differently than he did. He would have been an insufferable neighbor anywhere. In the middle of Kansas, with no buffer zone between claims, he was a particular achievement. Alasdair listened to all of this. He asked Rolf one question. Had the water been tested in late August or September when the summer had properly spent itself? Rolf looked at him the way a man looks at someone who has just said something technically in English but arranged in a deeply confusing order. "What kind of question is that?" Rolf said. "Water is water." Alasdair nodded and went home. In early June, while his neighbors were already hauling up buckets and feeling accomplished, Alasdair MacRae hired a well driller named Phineas Cobb from the town of Beloit, 30 miles to the northeast. Phineas arrived with a cable tool rig, a wooden derrick, a heavy iron drilling bit on a length of steel cable, and a steam-powered engine that burned coal and made a racket like a mechanical argument. The rig had been borrowed from an oil operation in Ohio and adapted imperfectly for water drilling, which meant it worked fine as long as you didn't ask it to do two things at once. Phineas was lean, 50-ish, perpetually coated in a fine gray dust that seemed to originate from somewhere inside him, and he charged $4 a day for his labor plus materials. In 1874, $4 a day was the kind of sum that caused men to stop walking and reconsider their life choices. Word traveled through the settlement at the speed of any news that involved someone doing something unusual with money. Within 48 hours of Phineas's arrival, Alasdair had received 3 unsolicited assessments of his financial wisdom, 2 visits from neighbors who happened to be passing by and lingered for 45 minutes, and 1 formal inquiry from Rolf Tanner, who arrived at his fence line on horseback at 7 in the morning with an expression that suggested he had been rehearsing something. "I hear you're paying Cobb to drill," Rolf said. "I am," Alasdair said. "Cobb charges $4 a day." "He does. My well cost me $11 total." There was a pause while Rolf let this figure sink in. $4 a day. For how many days? "However many it takes," Alasdair said. Rolf stared at the drilling rig for a long moment. "How deep are you going?" Alasdair looked at the prairie, at the sky, at the faint shimmer of heat already forming on the horizon at 7 in the morning. "Deep," he said. This was not the answer Rolf had come for, but it was the only one on offer. So he rode away with it and did his best. The actual depth Alasdair had in mind was 85 feet. He hadn't arrived at this figure casually. He had spent 3 months before the move reading everything he could find about the geology of the Kansas plains, writing letters to the State Geological Survey in Topeka and corresponding with a man named Dr. Charles Hartley at the University of Edinburgh, who had spent 2 years studying American groundwater systems and had written a paper about deep confined aquifers, layers of water trapped between impermeable rock formations, pressurized by their own geography, utterly immune to surface conditions. Dr. Hartley's paper made a specific observation that Alasdair had underlined twice in pencil, and then once more in ink for emphasis. Shallow wells draw from the perched water table, which is directly connected to surface conditions. Deep confined aquifers draw from water that has been accumulating for thousands of years and moves on geological timescales. A dry summer depletes the first. It barely touches the second. Alasdair had also relied on 22 years of underground experience, which had given him a feel for how water moved through rock and earth that was difficult to explain to someone who had never had a conversation with a seam wall at 40 feet below the surface. He had read the outcrops along Drummond Creek during his first week on the claim, walking the bank for 2 miles in each direction and examining the exposed strata with the focused attention of a man reading a letter he's been waiting for. What he found confirmed what he suspected. Beneath the shallow sand and gravel that held the surface water table, the geology changed. There were layers of clay, then limestone, then more clay. Below that, and this was the part that the cable tool rig was going to have to earn its keep for, there was a different kind of formation entirely, older and deeper, where the water would not be seasonal or dependent on last winter's snowpack or whether the rains had come generous or mean. Phineas Cobb drilled for 18 days. The first 7 days took the bit through the easy upper layers: sand, gravel, soft clay, the same material everyone else's wells had gone through, reaching water at 20 feet and continuing downward past it. Alasdair's neighbors took note of this with the mixture of bafflement and quiet satisfaction that people feel when someone else's expensive decision begins to look like a mistake. Rolf Tanner visited 3 times in those 7 days, each time standing at the fence line and watching the rig work with an expression of sustained concern that was really, at its core, a form of happiness. "You've already got water," Rolf called over on the 5th day. The bit was at 38 feet. "Cobb's gauge shows water at 22, same as mine." "Different water," Alasdair said. Rolf opened his mouth, closed it, and rode away. Days 8 through 14 were harder. The bit hit clay at 40 feet and stayed in it for 5 full days, moving at a rate that tested everyone's patience, including Phineas Cobb's, which was professionally calibrated to absorb delay but had its limits. The clay came up in heavy dark chunks the color of old boots, and Alasdair examined each bucketful with the interest of a man reading promising evidence rather than experiencing expensive inconvenience. The clay was good news. Clay was the cap. Below a clay layer like this one, thick, consistent, stretching in both directions as far as the drill cuttings could tell him, was where the confined water lived. Clara brought water and bread to the men working the rig at midday. She watched her husband study the clay and said, in the tone of a woman who has decided to be supportive but wants it on the record that she has reservations, "It had better be good water at the bottom of all this." Alasdair told her it would be the best water in the county. Clara said she would hold him to that, which she always did about everything. The settlement's collective opinion of the project had solidified by the end of the 2nd week into something that mixed genuine curiosity with the comfortable certainty that this was going to end badly for the Scotsman. Henderson, the homesteader on the claim immediately north of Alasdair's, a quiet Pennsylvanian named George Henderson who had arrived with his wife Marta and 2 daughters, came over on a Tuesday evening and asked honest questions about what Alasdair expected to find. He wasn't mocking. He was genuinely trying to understand. Alasdair explained confined aquifers. He used the analogy of a bottle sealed with a cork. Water trapped under pressure between impermeable layers, sealed off from the surface world above it, carrying ancient rainwater that had fallen during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson and been slowly moving underground toward Kansas ever since. Henderson listened to all of this carefully. Then he asked the question that was really the question. "And if the drought comes, this water stays?" "This water doesn't know there's a drought," Alasdair said. "It's been underground since before any of us were born. It doesn't follow the weather. It follows geology." Henderson went home and told his wife. Marta Henderson, who was considerably sharper about certain things than any of the men around her were prepared to acknowledge, said, "We should have asked him where to put our well before we dug it." George said they'd already dug it. Marta said she was aware of that, thank you. On day 16, at 68 feet, the clay ended. The bit dropped into a layer of coarse sandstone that Phineas Cobb recognized immediately from his oil drilling days as a high porosity formation. The kind of rock that soaks water the way bread soaks broth. Alasdair stood at the edge of the borehole that evening with a lantern and watched the cuttings come up, rubbing the gray-brown sand between his fingers. And he smiled, the very small smile of a man who has been right about something complicated for a long time and doesn't want to make a show of it. Not yet. On day 18, at 85 feet, the water came up the casing without being pumped. This was the detail that made everything else make sense and also made it expensive to ignore. Artesian pressure. The water in the deep confined aquifer was under natural pressure from the weight of the rock formation above it and the elevation of the recharge zone far to the west, where these ancient layers met the surface in the distant uplands. When the drill punched through the lower cap of clay and hit the sandstone, the water pushed upward through the casing and surfaced on its own. Not a trickle, not a seep, a steady, cold, pressurized column of water that came up from 85 feet below the Kansas prairie and didn't ask permission. Phineas Cobb had seen artesian wells before in Ohio mostly, but always with some private excitement that he could not fully suppress. He put his hand in the flow and then, with the gravity of professional confirmation, looked at Alasdair MacRae and said, "There's your well, sir." The water temperature, measured with the thermometer Alasdair had brought from Scotland in a leather case as though it were a family heirloom, was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the temperature the deep earth maintained regardless of what the surface world was doing above it. Regardless of season, regardless of weather, regardless of drought. The total cost of the well was $91. Rolf Tanner's well had cost $11. The social arithmetic was unambiguous. Alasdair MacRae had spent 8 times what any reasonable man would spend on a hole in the ground, and the water that came out of it was wet, which was exactly what water from any other hole in the ground was. Rolf communicated this analysis to anyone who would listen, with an efficiency of communication that would have been admirable if employed in a better cause. The Norwegian family 3 claims to the south were told. The 2 brothers from Ohio who had settled the next ridge were informed. By the end of June, the deep well's reputation in Osborne County was precisely that of an expensive joke with no punchline yet arrived at. What nobody said out loud, because saying it would have required acknowledging a level of uncertainty that prairie settlers generally preferred not to sit with, was that the summer of 1874 had begun dry. It had begun dry in a way that felt different from the dryness of a season simply being stingy. It felt like the beginning of something with more ambition. The last meaningful rain had fallen in the second week of May. Through June, the sky was polished blue and cloudless every morning in a way that photographers would have admired and farmers would not. The prairie grass turned from dark green to a faded yellow-green, and then, by the end of the month, to a dusty brown gold that bent in the wind like paper. Drummond Creek ran normally through June. It had a good depth of snowmelt behind it from the previous winter, and it moved along with cheerful indifference to the cloudless sky above it, the way a creek will when it doesn't yet know what's coming. In July, the temperature became serious. It reached 102 degrees on the 4th of July, which struck everyone as symbolically excessive, and it did not much cool down after that. The wind that came off the southern plains was not refreshing. It was the kind of wind that moved heat around rather than removing it, the way you can stir boiling soup without making it any cooler. The soil cracked in long, irregular lines across the fields, and the cracks widened through the month until they had the look of old pottery that someone had thrown against a floor. Drummond Creek began to narrow. This was not immediately alarming. Creeks narrowed in summer, that was normal. But it narrowed with a speed that was not normal, and by the 3rd week of July it was running at perhaps 1/3 of its June volume, a thin thread of brown-green water moving slowly between banks that were visibly too wide for it. Men walked to the creek and stood at its edge and looked at it with the particular expression of people who are beginning to revise their assumptions but haven't quite committed to the revision yet. The first shallow well failed on July 26th. It belonged to a young farmer named Eli Goss, who had dug to 20 feet in April with great confidence and hit water at 18. Eli dropped his bucket down on the morning of the 26th and heard nothing. The hollow thock of the bucket hitting dry earth rather than the satisfying splash of water taking the bucket's weight. He dropped it twice more, as if repetition might change the geology, and then walked to the creek, which by this point was a trickle running through mud, and stood there for a long time in the early morning heat thinking about his options. The second failure came 3 days later, and then they came faster. 2 in the first week of August, then 3 more before the middle of the month. The pattern was predictable in hindsight and devastating in real time. The shallow wells that had drawn from the same perched water table had been drawing from the same finite reservoir, a shallow lens of water that sat above the clay layer and was replenished entirely by rain and surface runoff. When the rain stopped and the creek stopped contributing, that lens began to shrink from below. The water table dropped. The wells that had seemed so adequate in May, so obviously sufficient at 22 and 26 and 28 feet, were suddenly reaching down into empty sand. Drummond Creek went dry on August 11th. It went dry in the middle of the day, in full Kansas sun with no drama or ceremony. 1 hour it was a trickle, and the next hour it was a mud channel with a few disconnected puddles reflecting the white sky above them. The surveyor who had named it apparently hadn't anticipated this as an outcome, but then surveyors rarely do. They name things after what they find. They don't guarantee the finding will persist. The community, which had been managing its unease for 3 weeks with the particular stoicism of people who believed that admitting a problem aloud might make it worse, could no longer defer the reckoning. A meeting of sorts happened organically on the afternoon of August 12th. Not formally convened, but gathered in the way that people gather when the situation has become larger than any individual willingness to ignore it. 7 men stood at the dry bed of Drummond Creek in the thick August heat looking at the mud. Rolf Tanner was there. George Henderson was there. Eli Goss was there, already 2 weeks into hauling water by barrel from a spring 6 miles east that still ran but was visibly under stress. 3 others, all in varying states of well failure or imminent well failure, stood in the sun and said things that were mostly variations on the same observation. The water was gone. Alasdair MacRae was not at the creek. He was at his farm where his well was running. It had not stopped running since the day Phineas Cobb's bit had reached the sandstone formation at 85 feet, and the artesian pressure had pushed the water up through the casing. The drought that had emptied Drummond Creek and lowered the water table below the reach of every shallow well in the county had done exactly what Alasdair had predicted it would do to a confined aquifer. Nothing. The deep water did not know about the drought. It had been accumulating since before these settlers' grandfathers were born. It sat under pressure in its sealed sandstone formation and continued with geological patience to flow. The temperature of the water, measured daily in Alasdair's ledger with the same thermometer that had confirmed the artesian discovery, remained 53 degrees Fahrenheit through the entire month of August. Not 53 one day and 48 the next. 53 constant, the way the deep earth keeps its temperature regardless of what the atmosphere above it decides to do. It tasted clean and faintly mineral, the way good deep water does, with none of the surface sourness that shallow wells developed as their water sat in unreplenished soil. Clara, who had expressed skepticism about the whole enterprise for months, filled a glass from the well on the morning of August 12th, drank it slowly, and said, "Fine, you were right." This was, from Clara MacRae, a formal monument of acknowledgement. Rolf Tanner came on the afternoon of August 13th. He came alone, which was unusual for Rolf, who generally preferred to deliver opinions in front of an audience. He left his horse at the fence and walked to where Alasdair was fixing a section of fence post, and he stood there for a moment in a posture that communicated a great deal without using words. Alasdair kept working. He had the specific patience of a man who had spent 20 years underground in the dark and developed a relationship with silence that was frankly healthier than most of his relationships with noise. "My well's dry," Rolf said finally. "I know," Alasdair said. Another pause. "Got down to 4 feet of water last week, 2 feet yesterday. Nothing this morning." Alasdair set down his tools and looked at Rolf Tanner directly. Rolf was a man who wore his emotions on his face the way other people wear their clothes. There was no layer between what he felt and what showed up on his face. What showed up now was the particular combination of pride and desperation that is uniquely human, and almost always heartbreaking to witness in a man who has spent months being certain of things that have since proved otherwise. "You can draw from my well," Alasdair said. "You and your family any time." Rolf opened his mouth and then didn't say anything for a moment. The silence had a different quality than his usual silences, which were merely pauses for breath between opinions. This one was the silence of a man renegotiating his understanding of a situation. "I said your well was foolishness," Rolf said. His voice was flat, stating a fact. "You said what you thought," Alasdair said. "That's not a crime. Bring your barrels." George Henderson had already come 2 days before because George Henderson was the kind of man who assessed situations accurately and then acted on them without a great deal of internal theater. He'd arrived with 2 10-gallon barrels on a flatbed wagon and said simply, "Your well still going?" When Alasdair said yes, George had said, "Thank God," in a tone that suggested this was less a religious observation than a thermometer reading on the state of things. He filled his barrels, thanked Alasdair, and returned the next morning with Clara, who helped Marta Henderson load a 3rd barrel. The 2 women had developed a friendship of the type that forms between people who live a mile apart on an empty prairie, and discover they are each other's only option for interesting conversation. It was a friendship made of necessity that had become one of genuine fondness, which is often the best kind. Eli Goss came on August 14th, young and embarrassed and terribly thirsty. He had been making the 12-mile round trip to the Eastern Spring every other day, and the spring was failing too. Its flow was now barely enough to fill 2 barrels. He'd started rationing water for his animals, giving his horses and the 1 milk cow just enough to keep them alive and no more, which is the kind of calculation that ages a farmer faster than years. He stood at Alasdair's well and put his hand in the flow of cold water and simply stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. He was 26 years old and had come to Kansas the previous year with $140 in a plan. The plan had not included contingencies for water. Most plans at that age don't. The well served them all. Alasdair had rigged a proper pump mechanism in June, a hand pump with a cast-iron spout that could fill a 10-gallon bucket in under a minute with efficient working. The artesian pressure helped considerably. The water was already pushing upward. The pump mostly directed it. He had also, with a foresight that was beginning to seem supernatural in August but had seemed merely methodical in June, built a water trough beside the well from 2-inch planking sealed with pine tar, large enough to hold 100 gallons at a time, which he kept full for neighbors' livestock when their own water sources failed. The widow Pruitt came on August 17th, and this was the visit that none of the people who witnessed it ever quite forgot how to talk about. Martha Pruitt was 67 years old, a widow of 3 years, and she had come to Kansas with her son and daughter-in-law, who had subsequently returned to Illinois when the daughter-in-law's mother took ill and never came back. Martha had stayed because there was nowhere else that made the same kind of sense, which she acknowledged was not a great deal of sense. She had a claim of 60 acres that she worked herself with the assistance of a hired boy named Marcus, who was 14 and had his grandmother's determination. Her well had gone dry on August 10th, and she had been making do with what she could carry from the creek before it stopped, and then from rain barrels that the cloudless sky had contributed nothing to for weeks. She arrived at Alasdair's farm on a mule that she rode with the easy competence of someone who has been riding mules longer than many of her neighbors have been alive. 2 barrels roped to the saddle, and she pulled up at the gate with the upright posture of a woman who has decided to ask for help and is not going to apologize for it. Alasdair was in the field, Clara saw her come and went out to meet her. What passed between the two women in the first minute was functional. Martha explained what she needed, Clara said of course. But then something else happened that Clara described later to Alasdair. In the quiet of their house after the day was done, in words that she chose carefully because she was not a woman who wasted language, Martha Pruitt had climbed down from her mule and walked to the well pump and put her hands on the cold iron of the spout and stood there with her eyes closed for a long moment before she pumped a drop. Just stood there with her hands on it. Then she pumped, and the cold, deep water came up and ran over her hands, and she said very quietly, "Thank God for the stubborn ones." Clara told Alasdair this. Alasdair was quiet for a moment, and then he went to bed, because he was not a man who had words for certain kinds of moments. But he lay awake for a while in the dark, listening to the prairie night, which was immense and full of insects and warm in a way that made you feel the land's aliveness. And he thought about the water 60 feet below him that had been there since before anyone had arrived to argue about it. Moving slowly through the dark sandstone, cold and clean and utterly indifferent to whether anyone believed in it or not. The well served the community through all of August and into September. By the end of the third week of August, Alasdair was receiving visitors at an average of 4 or 5 per day, arriving with barrels and buckets and the particular expressions of people who have stopped being embarrassed and started being grateful, which is a transition that the human face makes awkwardly but the human heart makes fairly quickly when the alternative is dying of thirst. He organized a schedule. Neighbors to the north in the mornings, south and east in the afternoons, with the trough kept full for livestock at all hours. Clara managed the schedule with the organizational precision of someone who had been waiting her whole life for a project worthy of her capabilities. The flow from the well did not diminish. This was the fact that no one could stop thinking about. Every other water source in 20 miles had failed or was failing. The creek was a dry scar in the earth. Every shallow well was either dry or producing water so low in the casing that buckets came up half empty with silt. And Alasdair MacRae's well was producing cold, clean, 53-degree artesian water from 85 feet below the prairie with the same steady pressure it had produced on the first day, because it was drawing from a formation that summer drought could not reach in 100 years of trying. Rolf Tanner came every second day with his barrels. He and Alasdair had developed a relationship during the drought that was not quite friendship but was genuinely something. The specific kind of respect that forms between two people when one of them has been spectacularly wrong about the other and has the decency to acknowledge it without being told to. Rolf was not a man built for apology in the formal sense, but he was a man built for work, and he showed up one morning in late August with a second pair of barrels and his 2 youngest boys and helped Alasdair rebuild the water trough with heavier planking because the old one was showing wear from the traffic. He said nothing explanatory about this. He just showed up with lumber and nails and his boys and they built it, and then he filled his barrels and left. That, Alasdair thought, was probably as good as it was going to get from Rolf Tanner. And it was frankly better than he had expected. The drought broke at the end of September with 2 days of steady rain that was not spectacular or dramatic but was simply continuous, the kind of rain that soaks in instead of running off, the kind the earth had been waiting for. The creek bed darkened and then filled and then ran, first a trickle and then a proper creek, and within a week Drummond Creek was moving again with what sounded like relief. The shallow wells began recovering by the second week of October. The water table rising back up through the sand and gravel as the rain replenished the surface aquifer, and men lowered their buckets and heard the splash and felt the particular gratitude that comes with the return of something you had almost stopped expecting to return. But the things that had been learned during those 8 weeks of summer drought did not go away when the rain came. They had been learned in the hardest classroom available, necessity, and they stuck. George Henderson came to Alasdair in October with a notebook. He said he wanted to record the construction details of the deep well before memory softened the particulars. He was systematic about it, asking about the geology Alasdair had read before drilling, the correspondence with Dr. Hartley in Edinburgh, the specific depth and the materials of the casing, the daily cost of Phineas Cobb and how many days the work had taken. He wrote it all down in neat Presbyterian handwriting and then sat with his pencil resting and said, "If I'd known what I know now, I'd have drilled deep from the beginning." "Most people learn water the hard way," Alasdair said. "They learn it from the drought, not from the geology." George asked him how he had known to learn it differently. Alasdair thought about this for a moment, about the coal mines in Fife, about the men he had known who had died because the water came where it wasn't expected, about the paper from Dr. Hartley that he had read in a boarding house in Glasgow on a November evening before the journey, sitting by a lamp that gave just enough light to read but not enough to be comfortable, circling paragraphs with the attention of a man who knows he will not be able to return to the library from wherever he is going. He thought about all of this and gave George Henderson the answer that was honest rather than modest. "I came from underground," he said. "When you work underground, water is not an abstraction. It has opinions, it has a geography. It comes from somewhere and it goes somewhere, and if you don't know where, it finds you instead of you finding it." George wrote this down. He had the literal disposition of a man who would eventually become the kind of person younger settlers came to for advice, and he was already in the process of becoming that person without fully realizing it. The following spring, 3 neighbors drilled deep wells. George Henderson was the first, hiring Phineas Cobb back for a return engagement that Phineas accepted with the mild satisfaction of a craftsman whose work has been vindicated. The Henderson well struck the same sandstone formation at 62 feet. Alasdair had predicted it would be there based on the slight topographic difference between their claims, and produced artesian water with a pressure only slightly less than Alasdair's own. Martha Henderson, who had been right about this the previous year, said finally in a tone that George chose not to examine too closely. Eli Goss drilled in March as well, going to 70 feet before he hit a reliable formation at a cost that cleaned out most of what he had saved over winter. He stood at his new well on the day it was finished, watching the water come up through the casing in that initial artesian surge. And the expression on his face was the expression of a man who will never again have to haul water 6 miles in August, which is a specific happiness that people who have done that task can immediately recognize and people who haven't can barely imagine. He was 27 now, 1 year older and 1 drought wiser, and he told anyone who asked that the well had cost 3 times what he could comfortably afford and that he would do it again without hesitation. Rolf Tanner was the last of the immediate neighbors to drill in April of 1875. He waited until spring in a way that was neither procrastination nor stubbornness but something in between. A man working through a decision that required him to reorganize several firmly held positions before he could arrive at the new one. When he finally hired the driller, he did not ask Alasdair for advice, which Alasdair noted without comment. But he drilled to 80 feet, which was almost exactly what Alasdair had done, which suggested he had done his reading or at least had talked to George Henderson. The well hit water at 73 feet. Clean, cold, pressurized. Rolf sent his son over to tell Alasdair, and Alasdair sent back a bottle of whiskey that he had been keeping for an occasion, which was the kind of gesture whose exact meaning was clear to both men and required no elaboration. The summer of 1875 was drier than average, though it did not reach the extremes of 1874. Drummond Creek narrowed and slowed, but did not stop. The shallow wells of people who had not yet drilled deep went low but did not fail. It was the kind of dry summer that was instructive rather than catastrophic, a semester rather than an examination, and the settlement moved through it with the quiet confidence of people who had passed the examination once already and knew what the answers were. By the end of the decade, the practice of deep well drilling had become normal in Osborne County, not universal. There were still men who pointed at their 25-foot wells and said their fathers had survived on shallower, but common enough that Phineas Cobb had steady work and eventually moved his rig to a permanent base in Beloit and hired an assistant. The geological information that Alasdair had compiled from his correspondence and observations circulated through informal channels. Neighbor to neighbor, father to son, the kind of practical knowledge that travels without attribution until no one can remember where it started. County agents included notes about confined aquifer indicators in their agricultural bulletins by 1880. The language was different from anything Alasdair would have used, more formal, more careful. But the underlying observation was the same one he had underlined twice in pencil and once in ink in Dr. Hartley's paper in Glasgow in 1873. The water you will need in your worst summer is not the water you can reach in the spring. It is the water that has been waiting underground for longer than your country has existed. The drought of 1874 was remembered in Osborne County for years afterward with the specific texture that local disasters acquire when they become defining stories. The kind of story told at supper tables and passed down through families in the direct, unembellished way that real things get passed down. People remembered the dry bed of Drummond Creek. They remembered the cracked earth of August. They remembered coming to Alasdair MacRae's farm with their barrels and their animals and their children and drawing cold water from a well that the summer could not defeat. What they did not always remember, or perhaps what they remembered but did not always say, was the context in which that well had come to exist. They remembered the water. They did not always remember the months of ridicule that had preceded it, the daily assessments of Alasdair's financial judgment delivered by Rolf Tanner at the fence line, the general community consensus that $91 in 18 days and 85 feet of drilling was a kind of madness particular to Scotsmen and possibly to immigrants in general. Memory has a habit of editing out the ridicule once the thing ridiculed has been proven right, the way a surgeon's portrait never includes the patient who said, "Are you sure about this?" before the operation. Alasdair kept his ledger, not out of vindication but out of habit. The habit of a pit foreman who had learned that the difference between what you thought was underground and what was actually underground could be the difference between coming home and not coming home. The ledger recorded the depth of the well, the daily temperature readings of the water, the rainfall figures for each month, the number of neighbors and their families who drew from the well during the drought, the number of barrels filled, the weeks during which Drummond Creek ran dry. It was not a dramatic document. It was a measurement document. But it existed, which meant the story could be verified rather than merely told, and in a world where most arguments about how things should be done are settled by whoever talks loudest, the existence of a precise handwritten record of what had actually happened was not a small thing. Clara kept the thermometer on a shelf in the kitchen. Long after the drought was a memory and the deep wells were a normal feature of the county landscape, she would occasionally take it down and turn it in her hands, the way people handle objects that carry weight beyond their function. It was a precise instrument in a leather case purchased in Scotland, carried across an ocean and used to measure water temperature at the bottom of a hole in the Kansas prairie. It had measured 53 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst summer in living memory, day after day, indifferent to the devastation occurring above it on the surface. The number had been correct when Alasdair needed it to be correct, which in Clara's accounting was the most important thing an instrument could do. On a November evening in 1876, with the harvest in and the winter approaching with its usual lack of interest in whether you were ready, Alasdair sat at the table in the lamplight writing a letter to Dr. Hartley in Edinburgh. He wrote about the drought of 1874 and what had happened. He wrote about the well and the water temperature and the 8 weeks of community dependence on a single deep borehole. He described the geology as precisely as he could, the clay cap and the sandstone formation and the artesian pressure that had pushed the water up without pumping. He wrote about his neighbors and what they had learned and what they had built in the year after. At the end of the letter, he wrote a single sentence that stood by itself at the bottom of the page. Set apart the way you set apart something you have been thinking about for a long time before putting it down in writing. The water that saves you in the worst summer is the water you planned for before the drought began. And the time to plan for the worst summer is when the rains are plentiful and no one believes a worse summer is coming. He sealed the letter and put it on the shelf with the thermometer, where Clara found it in the morning and asked if it was going to Beloit to be posted or just living there on the shelf for philosophical purposes. Alasdair said he'd take it to Beloit at the end of the week. Clara said she'd believe it when she saw it, which was her standard position on her husband's timelines, and handed him his coffee. Outside, the well stood in the November cold, the pump handle still, the water 53 degrees down in the dark at 85 feet, moving slowly through the ancient sandstone, unaware of drought or winter or the passage of seasons above it, carrying the memory of rain that had fallen on distant uplands before Kansas was a state or a territory or a name on any map. Water that had been going somewhere for centuries and had found at the end of its long underground journey a good use. If you value these stories of practical wisdom and stubborn foresight, the kind that got mocked on Monday and thanked on Friday, make sure to subscribe. There are more of them. The people who thought 3 moves ahead rarely left the loudest records, but they left the most useful ones, and we're still finding them.